So, hello everyone. Welcome to this new talk of our series, Tibet in Canada, Canada on Tibet. So, as the title of the series suggests, what we are trying to do here is to see who is doing research at the convergence of Canada and Tibet. So, it can be Tibetan scholars based in Canada, it can be Canadian scholars studying Tibet, or non-Canadian scholars but working in Canada, studying Tibet. And in this case today, this is actually the first talk where the researcher is not Canadian and not Tibetan, but she's based in France, but she is studying Tibetans in Canada. So let me introduce with great pleasure our speaker here today, Anne-Sophie Bentz. She's an associate professor of South Asian history at Université, Paris-Cité, and a fellow at Institut Convergence Migration. She received her PhD from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva in 2009. And then she taught international relations at the University of Toulouse for a short while. And then she held a postdoc fellowship at the University of Zurich's Asia and Europe program. So now she's been in Paris since 2012, so at Université Paris-Cité, and she focuses on nationalism and post-colonial studies and theories, as well as refugee and diaspora politics. Her thesis was entitled Nationalism in Exile, Tibetan Refugees in India, and it was published in 2010 by the Presse Universitaire de France. It focuses on the relations between nationalism and exile by means of a case study on Tibetan refugees in India. She's the author of multiple articles and book chapters on Tibetan and also other refugee communities in India, especially Afghan, Burmese, and Sri Lankan refugees, and also on South Asian refugees in the West, especially in Canada, as for today, and in France. She has recently edited two special issues on South Asian migrants, and she's currently principal investigator of a project on political mobilization in exile. And we are part of the same project based in France, Diasco-Tib, on the cultural and linguistic convergence of the Tibetan diaspora, especially in France. But today she will talk to us about her work on Tibetan political mobilization in Canada. So without further ado, thank you very much, Anne-Sophie.
Well, thank you, Isabel, for the introduction. And I wanted first to thank Grit for inviting me to present my research on Tibetans in Toronto, and also to thank Grit for rescheduling my talk, which had originally been scheduled in early January, but at the time I was too sick to present anything. So I will share my PowerPoint with you, and I think I can do that now that I'm co-host. And here is my PowerPoint, which I will start from the beginning. So my talk today is going to be on refugee citizenship, or how to be a Tibetan in Canada. And first, I want to say that citizenship is not what I usually work on when I work with refugees. What I usually work on are nationalism and political mobilization. But this being said, I have already explored the question of citizenship with a case study on Sri Lankan Tamils, so it is not entirely foreign to me. And when I did my fieldwork in Toronto in September, October 2019, I used a questionnaire where part 3 was dedicated to life in Canada And in that, the Tibetan's legal situation. So I wanted to understand more specifically what the Tibetan's legal situation was. And in that subpart, I had this question: do you still consider yourself a refugee? This, for me, was not an entirely new question that I started to ask Tibetans in Toronto when I checked the questionnaire I had used during my PhD thesis years. And I used that questionnaire all over India in many different Tibetan settlements in India. Obviously, the question at the time was, do you consider yourself a refugee? There was no still there. So the question was not new. And even at the time, the answers, the reactions I got to that question were quite interesting. But in Toronto, the answers were so interesting that I thought I really had to do something about it. I had to write an article about this idea of considering oneself as a refugee. And this is what I did. I wrote an article about how citizens, and here meaning Canadian citizens, could still be or feel like or consider themselves as refugees, that is, as Tibetan refugees. And in all the questionnaire, it was quite a long questionnaire. This really was the trickiest questions. My respondents, all of them, took a long time answering it, which for me tends to show that they were really thinking about what it meant for them to be a refugee, and consequently, because this is the other side of being a refugee, to be a citizen. So what do I mean by refugee citizenship? This is a notion that I use to talk about the citizenship that is either sought after or already acquired by refugees who want, but also actively strive to retain some aspects of refugeehood. So it is a concept that puts together refugee and citizen, which are two concepts that are usually opposed. And I will explain how I came to put them together with the answers I got from the Tibetans I interviewed in Toronto during that fieldwork. So first, let me talk in order to explain how Tibetans in Canada came to be regarded and to regard themselves as simultaneously Tibetan refugees and Canadian citizens. I will not dwell on that because I think this is something that most of you know. So first, I'm going to look at the what the Tibetan government in exile did in South Asia. In South Asia, Tibetans were encouraged by the government in exile to stay in the settlements and to refrain, and this is the important aspect here, to refrain from adopting Indian, Nepalese, or Bhutanese citizenships. And this is something that, but you all know this, you can find in many more details in Fiona McConnell's book. At the same time, the Tibetan government in exile, with the Charter of Tibetans in Exile, the 1991 Charter, came up with this idea of a Tibetan citizenship, which by procuring, well, by giving Tibetans some kind of passport, and by offering the possibility of paying taxes in the form of a voluntary annual contribution, try to make real this, to give some concrete material in this Tibetan citizenship. So we can see here how in countries like India or Nepal or Bhutan, where Tibetans were either refused or were denied citizenship, this idea, this concept of a Tibetan citizenship formalized their sense of belonging. It does not mean that they did not feel Tibetan before, but the Tibetan identity that they had was formalized in this concept of Tibetan citizenship. And the question that I wanted to ask in this article was, how this Tibetan citizenship still applied for Tibetans who lived outside South Asia. It was meant for Tibetans who lived in South Asia, but how could it still apply? Yeah. And here I am thinking of the new strategy, which is a total reversal of the strategy adopted in South Asia by the Tibetan government in exile, the new strategy by which Tibetans in the West have been asked to apply for citizenship in the host countries and to use Western countries to promote the cause of Tibet. And this, but you probably all know this, is something that you can find with many more details in Julia Hess's work. So with this new strategy, Tibetans are expected to retain and promote their Tibetanness, but through their newly acquired Western citizenships. And this is a total reversal of what they were asked to do in South Asia. So my argument goes that this Tibetan citizenship, in which those Tibetans living outside South Asia also recognize themselves, can be seen as the equivalent of Tibetan refugeehood, where refugeehood is correlated with statelessness. This means that being Canadian or about to become Canadian does not mean that the previous identity, which was refugeehood, which had been rearticulated as Tibetan citizenship by the Tibetan government in exile, needs to or should be forgotten. A few words about Canada's refugee policy and citizenship laws, but here again, I do not want to dwell on that part of my presentation because this is something that you already widely know. There are two ways for Tibetans to come to Canada. Overseas processing, which only concerns a minority of Tibetans in Canada. It concerned those Tibetans who had come as part of a program, there were two of them, and who were granted permanent resident status before coming to Canada, and then after arriving in Canada were allowed, after a few years, to apply for Canadian citizenship. And the other way to come to Canada is through inland processing. This is the way that has been used for most Tibetans in Canada. It was, from what I heard, also relatively easy for them to obtain refugee status and Canada. And subsequently to obtain permanent residency. But again, this was not something that they had before coming to Canada, as the other Tibetans who came through overseas processing had, and thus afterwards to get Canadian citizenship. So now that I've dealt with this historical legal background, both from the Tibetan government in exile's part and from the Canadian part, I want to focus on my fieldwork. I want to say a few words about my fieldwork. You already know that I conducted it just before the pandemic in September, October 2019. There are in total 16 in-depth interviews based on an open-ended questionnaire that I already mentioned. It was conducted mainly in Parkdale, but also in Etobicoke. And the study, as I said, did not focus on citizenship. It focused indeed on the political mobilization of Tibetans in Canada, but many of the questions aimed at gathering personal stories and at better understanding feelings of identity and belonging about Tibet and Canada. And this is also how I came to ask this question about feeling or considering oneself as a refugee. A few words now about the literature that I used in this article, which is the theoretical literature, I mean, which is a literature that dealt with the notion of refugee citizenship. So at the time when I wrote the article, this notion of refugee citizenship was not exactly widespread in the literature, and the literature on citizenship, or in any other literature for that matter. And what I found was that there were two, what I found was that I could divide the use of refugee citizenship in this literature in two categories. First, there was a literature using this notion that was linked to the development of new forms of citizenship for non-citizens in camp and camp-like situations. And this literature used case studies, as you can see here, on Sahrawis or Palestinians or refugees around Calais, or even, some of you might know that, in Sarah Schneiderman's article, but I'm not going to dwell on that because she's rejecting that notion in this article. In this literature, refugee citizenship was linked to attempts made by refugees at creating some sorts of autonomous forms of identity, both in the camps or in border zones or camp-like situations, which means that these articles were usually focusing on refugee agency and how this agency was a way for refugees to claim citizenship or to enter somehow the realm of citizenship. But as you can see, this literature only deals with refugees in camp or camp-like situations, which was not the case for the Tibetans I talked to in Toronto. So the question that I wanted to tackle, having read that literature, was what happens to citizenship when refugees come out of the camps and do indeed acquire formal citizenship? How can these citizens still be or feel like refugees? The second type of literature that I dealt with was a literature in which the notion of refugee citizenship was linked to the limits of citizenship. I came across two articles, one looking at New Zealand, the other one looking at the European Union. What we need to remember here is that the refugee citizen in this literature is seen as something less than a citizen. It is like a second rank citizen, if you want. I have no idea what time it is. Well, I think I might have some time to talk about the only exception that I found, something different about the use of refugee citizenship. It was actually in an article that dealt with citizenship in Canada. So I thought it was quite interesting to look at it. And in this article, the refugee citizen was seen not as something less than a citizen, but as something more than a citizen. So, and if I quote him, he says that refugee citizenship, he sees refugee citizenship as a form of citizenship constituted by refugees who arrive from all over the globe with different cultural, social, and political heritages. And this was indeed interesting because I also argue for the use of refugee citizenship to reflect a new and mostly positive. So that was in a way similar what I found in that article, a positive meaning that some refugees who have become legal citizens in another country have ascribed to citizenship. So here we can see that refugeehood and citizenship are brought together through the refugee citizenship concept, whose meaning is perhaps closest to the idea of a dual citizenship, where the two parts of the equation inform each other without collapsing. And if you are still with me after this theoretical literature review,
yes,
I am now.
Don't worry.
Okay, but this was the hard part. We are now coming to more well, easier to understand parts. So I'm coming back to my field work, and in that question, I wanted to understand, well, with that question, I wanted to understand what it meant to be a refugee for those Tibetans that I met and interviewed in Toronto. And the answers that I got could be grouped, according to me, in three main categories. For some Tibetans, refugee referred only to a legal category, which meant that it was pretty straightforward. A refugee is someone with refugee status, and that's it. For some others, refugee refers to a socioeconomic condition. So a refugee is someone who lives as a refugee, someone who is poor, doesn't have a good job, lives in poor accommodation, etc. For some others, refugee was understood as an identity. And when it was understood as an identity, it was automatically associated with statelessness. So this meant that a refugee was someone who is someone who does not have a free anymore. And obviously, in that understanding of who a refugee is, being a Tibetan automatically means being a refugee, because Tibet does not have a free and independent homeland. So when I tried to put together a typology based on the answers I got, I also realized that the three meanings tended to collide. They are obviously at odds with each other, but sometimes I could get different answers from the same respondent. So this also meant that the three meanings were overlapping in sometimes unexpected ways. And this, for me, proves that the respondents, my respondents, tried really to think hard about what it meant to be a refugee on a very general level for other people, other refugees. And they wanted to explain this to me. But they also were thinking about what it meant for them, either on a personal level or on a more collective level, or on both. And you can see that in the answers I got. And here, obviously, I'm going to show some quotes. But before showing some quotes, I just wanted to come back to this idea of born Tibetan, born refugee. Well, first of all, because Maud Morin is here among us, and this idea of being born a refugee is an idea that I got a very long time ago when I first read her master's dissertation, which was entitled Né réfugié, so born refugee. And this really struck, and it stayed with me all those years. And in Maud Morin's work, it refers to the situation of those Tibetans who are born in India. And it can actually be applied to Tibetans who are born in South Asia, because being born in South Asia means being born a refugee. And this refers to the protracted refugee situation in those countries where Tibetans refused the citizenship of the country of residence, India or Nepal or Bhutan. And this idea of refusal you probably analyzed by Carol McGranahan in some of her most recent work, I would say. But this question of born Tibetan, born refugee is something that had a different resonance to it in Canada, because in Canada, and here I'm referring to the legal situation of Tibetans in Canada and to the policy of the Tibetan government in exile, refusal has been replaced by acceptance. Tibetans are becoming, in Canada, are becoming Canadian citizens. But my fieldwork has shown that refugee status is obviously given up, sorry. Tibetans are becoming Canadian citizens, but what is not given up is refugeehood. And this, for me, showed that being a refugee had become, in a way, part and parcel of the Tibetan's identity. And I promised you some quotes, and here they are. I'm going to start with Samten. Samten was reflecting on what it meant for him to be a refugee. And he was saying, refugee, oh yes, still, even though I have been here for quite long now, it never feels like a home. It is because we were born as a refugee. Our country is still occupied. Every time you feel you're a refugee, you should belong where you are from. We can also see this in Carl Sang's interpretation. Refugee, deep down, I still feel as a refugee. And before I comment on these quotes, I just want to show you two more. Okay, I just have oh yes, I can move this. Tupten, who told me, refugee, very much. Even if you're Canadian, you still have the Tibetan blood. Young people, I tell them, even if you change your hair color to yellow, it will be black again. And Gelek, explaining, I still consider myself a refugee. I came here as a refugee. Even in Nepal, where he was born, I considered myself a refugee. The whole spectrum around my existence is defined by being a refugee. It is a huge part of my identity. Some people say, I am a citizen now. I have heard that. I do not necessarily agree, but I can see where this comes from. For me, this is abnegation. So the conclusion for me from this quote is that a difference is status and identity. Being a Canadian citizen has to do with status, whereas being a Tibetan refugee, after refugee status is given up, is all about identity. And as soon as refugeehood is understood as an identity, is meant as something more than just a status or a social condition, Tibetans in Canada think of themselves as refugees. And when they do, they're equating being Tibetan with being a refugee. So this equation, being Tibetan, being a refugee, which appeared in South Asia where Tibetans have indeed some kind of refugee status, is not abandoned in Canada, where they become Canadian citizens, but reinterpreted. And well, the other difficult questions were, how can people be born refugees? And also, when do people stop being refugees? I've answered the first one, but if I want to answer the second one, I have to see, to look at the answer that some of the respondents gave me. When do Tibetans stop being refugees? They will stop being refugees when Tibet is free. And because Tibet is not free, Tibetans in Canada are still refugees. Well, if most of my respondents thought of refugeehood as an identity, or also as an identity, and that they insisted that that identity be Tibetan, the next question that I asked myself was the question of multiple identities. Is there only one identity, or can there be more identities? Which meant, can an identity be acquired at all? Is that a possibility that my respondents were considering? And here, I would like to share Rignam's view on that. Refugee, I would say no. It is a complicated question. I say that I am the child of refugees. Tibetans in general, we're all refugees, I guess, even though we are born in other countries. Metaphysically, at some level, I am. Canada is my country. It is a tricky question, but I would not say that affects my thinking. Canada is home, but so is Tibet, ancestral home. Even though going back to Tibet, you feel that you do not belong there either. I am a third culture kid. You do not truly belong anywhere. But I think of it as a privilege, being both from here and there. So you can see how here there is some kind of hesitation, which is overcome by this conclusion that Rignam is part of both worlds, Canada and Tibet. We can see this idea of being part of two worlds in Yudon's answer as well. Refugee, yes, I definitely have that experience, so it is still there. Now I have additional identities, Canadian citizenship. So multiple identities is an option, but there are two options, is an option for Tibetans in Canada, but it can go either way. It can either be seen as something negative, meaning you do not truly belong anywhere, or it can be seen as something positive. You are both from here and there. And in the answers that I got, I saw a predominance of the optimistic view, that is, being both from here and there. Linked to that question of multiple identities is the question of dual citizenship. If different identities can pile up like layers, if that is an option that is considered by some of my respondents, how many identities can there be in total? Well, as you can imagine, most of the time, there are usually only two, Tibetan and Canadian. These are the two parts of the equation. And this equation is best rendered by expressions that you have heard and you're probably quite familiar with: Canadian-Tibetan, Tibetan-Canadian. And these expressions, in my view, imply some kind of dual citizenship. The next question, if we think about dual citizenship and two parts of the equation, of an equation, is the question of hierarchy. Which part is more important? And here we can see in many of the Tibetan part is more important than the Canadian part. And this, saying this, comes down to saying that being a refugee is considered superior to being a citizen. It may sound very paradoxical, but if we accept the idea of a dual citizenship, it is less paradoxical than it sounds, because it means that considering that refugee identity, well, it means considering that refugee identity can be thought of as and lived like citizenship. And yes, I think I still have a little more time. So before jumping to my conclusion, I want to show you a counterpoint, Tashi's comment on dual citizenship on the two parts of the equation. Refugee, yes, because I look at the circumstances of how I came here. Now that I have lived all my life here, I feel less and less as a refugee. I feel more and more Canadian. So you can see here that the Canadian part is more important than the refugee part. And my interpretation of this is that there is no change of hierarchy. When Tashi says that being Canadian is more important for him than being a refugee, he does not mean, I think, that being Canadian is more important than being Tibetan. What I think happened in Tashi's understanding of refugeehood is a disconnection between being Tibetan and being a refugee, which is really something that I haven't seen in my other respondents' answer. Most of the time, there is a disconnection between being a Tibetan and being a refugee. But here, I think that Tashi is disconnecting the two, and which means that there is no change of hierarchy. Being Tibetan is probably as important or maybe more important for Tashi than being Canadian. The difference here is that he does not equate being a Tibetan with being a refugee. And now I can jump to my conclusion. So the Tibetan part of the equation has the meaning of citizenship according to me, and for most of the Tibetans I interviewed, and perhaps even the true meaning of citizenship, that is citizenship as identity and not just as status. And this is opposed to that in rare cases only refers to citizenship as status. But this was the case during my fieldwork 2019. Maybe this is not the case anymore. Maybe I would get different answers to the same question now. But at the time, in the Tibetan-Canadian expression, the Tibetan refugee part was regarded by most Tibetans as superior to the Canadian citizen part. And yes, I think, oh yes, that's something like 45 minutes, I think. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie, for your wonderful presentation. We can now open the floor to questions. You can now turn on the videos because I think it will be easier for us to when we see each other. If anyone has a question, I can give the first turn. Otherwise, I can ask the question. No, Isabel?
Yeah, thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. This was really nice, really neat. I actually have a few questions, but I'll just ask one now. Have you noticed any difference at all between the replies of Tibetans who came through South Asia, possibly were born in India and Nepal, or their parents were born there, and replies from Tibetans who came directly from Tibet, where this idea of Kyabjul, Tsenjul, being a refugee was not part of their education and their vocabulary and their identity construction. Um, I'm not sure how many Tibetans from Tibet are in Toronto. Yeah, probably it's overwhelmingly from South Asia. I know some Amdoas and some Kampas, but they may be very minority over there. I'm not sure. Um, yeah, just a question because they didn't have this experience of being educated in exile and with all this vocabulary. So I was wondering if it would make a difference.
Well, thank you, Isabel, for the question. It is indeed a very interesting question. And as I said, I have 16 respondents. Only one was from Tibet. Originally, did not come directly from Tibet to Toronto, spent some time in India. And his reply was very interesting because he considered himself a refugee. And indeed, in his answer came something that was quite unexpected for me. But when I reflected about it, should not have been that unexpected. In his answer came a new theme, well, the theme of purity, which is something that I have heard in India, where Tibetans from Tibet tried, not always, but sometimes, to distinguish themselves from Tibetans born in India by saying that they were purer than the Tibetans born in India because of this Tibetan origin. And here, my respondent was explaining to me how he was a pure refugee, as opposed to the Tibetans in Toronto who did not come directly from, well, were not born in Tibet, did not come from Tibet, whatever the journey was. And when he said that, he actually was denying refugeehood to those Tibetans who had been born in India and Nepal and who had been indeed refugees before coming to Canada, which was something that I found very strange and very interesting. He did not, because this was the question about, yeah, do you still consider yourself a refugee? So he was telling me that he was the pure refugee and denying refugeehood for all the other Tibetans in Toronto who were not from Tibet originally. So the answer was very interesting and quite different from the other answers I got. But in this, he was considering himself a refugee as well. So as an identity. And so in that sense, he was like all the others. But there was this question of purity, which was really interesting in his answer. In his answer, and for me, referred to something that I had heard in India. But not about refugees. as pure Tibetan.
Tserin love.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Anne-Sophie, for the presentation. I'm very interested in what you said about the ways in which people, Tibetans, particularly in Canada, authenticate their Tibetanness, to say the degrees of authenticity in terms of Tibetanness, right? And it sounds like from the participants who you had those interviews with, the 16 that you represented, that I had a very different experience, because I work in my field research is in Toronto and in Vancouver as well. And also because of the fact that I'm actually directly from Lhasa, even though I came directly, from Lhasa to Canada, even though I have exilic educational background. So I know there's not many people who are from that sort of a category. And but one of the things that what I noticed was a very interesting thing, and maybe I'll leave that up to you to interpret this. So one point I was at Kanchundeling, and I was just walking around, and I met these two elderly Tibetan ladies who said basically, who asked me, where are you from? Because we started talking, and they recognized my accent as being Lhasa accent, right? And so based on that, they started asking questions about, oh, so where are you from? And I said, I'm from Tibet. And this was later on. And so one of them said, yeah, originally we are all from Tibet. I meant, where did you come from? So the idea that even in Canada that somebody could come directly from Tibet is actually a very marginal idea. The idea is that almost every Tibetan who lives in Canada are from India or Nepal. And so this rhetoric of who the diasporic Tibetan is today, which you touched upon, and what I find very interesting is, where does the double consciousness that we talk about in diasporic studies, like in theorizing around double consciousness, how does that intersect with the idea of refugee citizenship that you're talking about? Because, in terms of the identity, the construction of identity as as a legal sort of like the political legal sort of framework, but there's also the identity in terms of like psychological and affiliation, that sort of a, pool from which people derive their identities as well. And so I think maybe that would also skew the hierarchy, as you call it, in terms of how Tibetans view their degrees of affinity in terms of refugeehood or citizenship. Yeah, my sense is that I found a lot of the people sort of look at Canadian citizenship initially in the first few years as a purely transactional social mobility kind of a instrument, Yeah. So yeah, I'd be very curious to know, in terms of the conclusion, it's just a very interesting question. And I wonder if you can speak more about the psychological component of it, the consciousness around it. Yeah.
I'm not sure I can talk separately about the psychological component, as I was including it in this, more generally in this identity part, as opposed to other aspects which are quite different, like status or socioeconomic condition. I think it informs the identity part, and I'm not sure how different my analysis would be if I tried to get the psychology out of it. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to add something about the my respondents, because I was talking about only 16 respondents. Most of them were quite young, because as I mentioned in the introduction, my work was about political mobilization. So this is probably a bias in the results, because I'm not sure what results I would have got if I had an age group that was much older than what I had. And as you said, I did not find many Tibetans who had come originally or directly from Tibet. Only one. Most of the others, which is in which is consistent with the Tibetan population in Toronto, are Tibetans from either Nepal or India. I was slightly surprised to find more Tibetans from Nepal than from India. But they had this, some of them had this experience of having been through the US. So that for some of them, there was that additional experience, which did not come up in that question. When I mentioned like the possibility of, well, multiple identities, different layers adding up, it was most of the time just two layers. In fact, there was not, even for those who had spent some time in the US, American identity was not part of this equation. But I'm sorry, I don't have much more to add about this psychological component.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. Exactly. Have you considered the concept of cultural citizenship rather than refugee citizenship? It's Renato Rosaldo. He's an anthropologist, and he was studying, showing how Latinos, for example, in the US, are US citizens, but of a different kind because they have a huge Latino cultural background. So it's citizenship plus culture. I wonder if that would be useful for you to look into those anthropological theories. But I know it's not your main discipline, so you may want to stick to your discipline, but it could be a useful tool. And I'll just copy in the chat the references here. I've looked at them quickly online.
Well, I think this is an interesting concept, and there are more of those concepts that I could have used, but what I wanted to get in the concept was a political dimension. And this is why I used this refugee citizenship concept, because of the political dimension that it brings to it. And my idea was that this concept could be used for other refugees in this, which who find themselves in the same situation or in a similar situation as Tibetans. And I have not mentioned this in my presentation, but in my article, I tried to think of how Palestinians, for instance, or Sahrawis, or Kurds, could also fall into this refugee citizenship concept, because the main idea is to apply the concept to refugees who use citizenship to good. And what I mean by promoting refugeehood is usually something that is directly linked to refugeehood, which is fighting for the homeland cause. And this is something that all the cases that I just mentioned here have in common. And this is something that you do not have in cultural citizenship. So it is a concept that I think can be used for other refugee groups, but not many of them. And there is this political dimension to it. And also there is this paradox of getting a citizenship to defend a refugeehood, which I found quite interesting.
That this is what Meredith Hess, whatever her name is, called cultural ambassadors or something, citizen ambassadors. I forgot.
Yes, yes,
Mm.
ambassadors of Tibet. Mm. Mm.
If no one else, did you want to say something else?
No, that's fine.
If no one else has a question, I can ask a question as well. I was wondering, you said that at some point citizenship in the West has been approved. And I was wondering, contrary to the citizenship in South Asian countries. So I was wondering if there is a ranking of Western countries where citizenship is more approved than in others. For example, is it better to strive for a US citizenship than a Canadian one? Or is it better to be a Swiss citizen? I don't know. Like,
not to my knowledge, no. The difference between those Western citizenships is that some of them are easier to get than others, and
it's okay if it's the same if you get a Polish citizenship and if you get an American citizenship. It's equally
well,
good.
I mean, the idea behind this change of policy was to try and get Tibetans to fight for the cause of Tibet from the country of residence. So obviously, if the country of residence is the US, this fighting from the US and may have more impact for the general than fighting from Poland.
Mm-hmm. And when was it that this policy has been officially promoted?
Well, the policy, I don't have an exact date, and I'm not sure there is one, but the policy is linked to the further diasporization of the Tibetans outside South Asia. So starting with the US resettlement project, 1990s.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Françoise Robin wrote something in the chat. Françoise is asking several questions. I will read it out. How do Tibetan refugees who claim to be refugees first and foremost relate with other refugees? I suggest doing Françoise's questions one by one.
Actually, I suggest you read the whole of it because it's a kind of big question
Okay,
subdivided
okay.
in.
So do they feel a closeness to them, a refugee identity that would transcend ethnic major borders, or does for them being a refugee imply always being a Tibetan refugee?
I think if I understand Françoise's question right, she's referring to some kind of a transnational refugee identity that could be shared by Tibetans with other refugee groups. So I think I can only answer for Canada and for Toronto, but I could say, and maybe Tsering can actually answer better than me. I could see a closeness with other refugees, and that closeness appeared when refugees from the same neighborhood, I'm thinking of Parkdale, were fighting for the same rights, like maybe residency rights would be a good example. Problems with landlords, so there were some kind of groups that were formed around these issues that are not just Tibetan issues, Tibetan refugee issues, but also other refugee issues in Toronto. I could also see some closeness around other issues, not necessarily refugees, but migrants. So some closeness with indigenous people, which was developed, and also with minorities. You can see that in the support that Tibetans brought to the Black Lives Matter issue at the time, just before I did my field work. So yes, there is definitely a closeness, but I cannot generalize. I cannot say that there is a closeness also in other places, because I don't know about other countries, and not so much about other countries and other places. I'm just reading the questions here. Just the last part of the question. For them, being a refugee imply always being a Tibetan refugee. But yes, the answer to that last question is definitely yes, from the answers I got from my respondents. But this does not mean that there cannot be some solidarity with other refugee groups, and also common fights, local fights, for instance, or international fights. Yes, I think. Well, if Françoise could talk, we would know if she needs more information. And maybe Tsering wants to add something on those questions.
I think maybe the last bit is what I find very interesting, is like, does it always imply being a Tibetan refugee? Like, are you always a Tibetan refugee? Because at that point, what you're also asserting is, there is a kind of exilic propaganda / conditioning that is inherent, like, it's become a part of the Tibetan diasporic consciousness. And so often when you talk about we are Tibetans and we are born refugees, there is absolutely a political and a politicized component to this kind of a rhetoric, right? And so I find that, and there's also layers within it, because who do you tell that to, and who's your audience when you say it, and how do you live, like, in terms of like the day-to-day life as and that public sort of a performance and a performativity to it, so that I find quite interesting, because it gets very complex as to how you show it and how you perform to it. And I don't mean that in just like a fake way, but, in terms of like the whole purposes behind it. Yeah.
If I can add something to Tsering's remark, I totally agree with her that there is this exile diasporic rhetoric behind it. And this is something that I noticed even more when I was doing my field work in India. And I forgot to mention that in the 16 respondents that I got, some were born, some had been born in Canada. So there were a few examples of Tibetans born in Canada. But what I wanted to add, yes, is that this question, do you still consider yourself as a refugee? It came usually as a surprise in my questionnaire. They were not expecting this question. So it was a bit of a shock. And this is what they had to stop and really think it over. And I think this is also why the answers, you can see the quotes. It started with, oh no, but no, yes. And it changes over the course of the answer. But yes, the surprise part was there, which means that, there could be time to think about this exile diasporic rhetoric and to include it, but not in the first reaction, which was quite interesting actually to get.
You are muted, Natalia.
I'm sorry, Celine, would you like to read out your question yourself, or should I read it?
Sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm sorry I don't mean to hog it, but if other people have questions, it doesn't need, so my question was, is there an evolutionary aspect? Because I think this is in reference to, the adoption of citizenship and what Natalia was talking about earlier. Is there a preference in terms of what kind of citizenship? So my question is, coming off of that, can there be because of, a part of what Anne-Sophie, you were mentioning in the presentation was the idea of how, initially there was a refusal of citizenship, and which is really well documented in the literature itself. But then later on, how that kind of changed when Tibetans moved away from South Asia, right? And like came into countries, particularly Western countries like Canada, US, and the Europe now. So I'm wondering if that is like part of that, like, do you think there's an element where it is sort of like the natural course of the diasporic, history, not just even, confined to the Tibetan case, but also across like the different victim diasporas, where there is almost seen as like an evolutionary aspect to it, and how much that contributed. Like, I just wanted to get your sense about it. Yeah.
I have tried to look at this evolution in other refugee cases. In that article, it is a bit different because, well, in the case of Tibetans, there is the refusal is part of the Tibetan government's in exile policy. Sometimes citizenship of the host country is refused to Tibetans, but also most of the time Tibetans themselves refuse the citizenship of the host country in South Asia. In the other cases that I looked at, I haven't found, well, it is a bit different for Palestinians, I have to say, but in the other cases, I haven't really found this idea of refusal. It is mostly cases where refugees just cannot get citizenship of the host country where they are staying, because this is, there are a few exceptions, but mostly those countries where they're staying, usually in camp-like situations, are neighboring countries. And as soon as they're able to get away from these neighboring countries and to go to the West, there is this possibility of acceptance, which they all take when they can. So it is slightly different, but the idea of refusal is there differently so in the Palestinian case, because for Palestinians, it was also seen as strategically interesting to refuse citizenship of the host country to keep refugeehood, because by keeping refugeehood, they thought that they could keep the right to return. This is something that is really central in the Palestinian case, which is not in the Tibetan case, but this right to return, they had thought for a long time that they would be deprived of it if they became citizens of the host countries, mostly neighboring countries. So yes, there is this evolutionary aspect, but the initial situation is sometimes a bit different. But from what I have seen, there is no question of not trying to adopt citizenship, especially when you manage to move to the West. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but if not, you just tell me and I...
Thank you.
Thank you, Cyrilla. Thank you, Anne-Sophie. I don't know if anyone else has a question. I have a little question on the history. So I will go ahead. How were Tibetans chosen for the program for overseas processing? You mentioned that it was a program, and I was just wondering who was eligible, or how does it work? Who gets access to it?
Yes, I think there are some people in the audience who might be able to answer that question better and with more details, but there were two groups of Tibetans that came through overseas processing. The first one is something that is a group that I am now very interested in, is the group, the first Tibetans who came to Canada in the 1970s. They came from India. I'm not sure exactly how they were chosen. I think they were handpicked, but there was no lottery involved, as was the case for the Tibetan US resettlement project. And I don't have the figures in front of me right now, but there were only, I think, in total 130 that came through this process. So that's the first group of Tibetans. And the second one is more recent. It dates back to the years 2010. And it involves a group of Tibetans. And if I'm wrong, please correct me, from a village in Arunachal Pradesh in India. And it was called the 1,000 Project. So 1,000 people from that small village, I think it was in Arunachal Pradesh, I don't remember the name of the village, came over a course of several years to Canada through that program. So there were two programs, and when I say it only involves a small minority, because the first group, it was just over 100 Tibetans, and the second group is a group of 1,000, but it is a very recent group, so it hasn't grown much since, through family reunification or other means.
Thank you. And do you, is there any source where one can read about this? For example, what was the age of those people who were selected for the first group, for example? It's a very small group, 130 people, and yeah, more. Please go ahead.
First Maud.
Yeah. Maud.
Yeah, it was more like 200 something for the, if I may correct you.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, we have 204, yes.
Yeah.
Also, I
That's
would...
the
Oh, sorry,
only thing
please.
I wanted to add.
No, please stop, Maud.
This was the only thing I wanted to add to the topic for now.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Yeah. Also, I would like to say that in the chat, I put this link for the project CHISEM. So CHISEM is a oral history, social memory project. It's grassroots, so it's the Tibetans themselves that have collected all the oral histories of the elders who came. I mean, they came as young people in the 1970s, 71, 72. And GRIT, as a group, is involved in the making both of the website and of the book that is coming out soon. So Rignam, that you quoted, Anne-Sophie, and Dikitoyang here in Montreal have been very active in eliciting these memories from the elders, and also photographs. So it's a major work of memories and history, oral history, that is being done here in Canada, and we are very happy as a group to have been just supportive, let's say, and allowed for some things. And we also, there will be a book, so we are also sponsoring the book production that is going to come soon, and then we'll do a book launch with all these stories. I think they have collected something like 40 family and personal histories, which are absolutely fabulous. You had the Panchen Lamas, the previous one, bodyguard, for example, who came out of exile. So there's a part of their history in Tibet, a part of their history in early exile in India, and then all of their stories in Canada and their children. It's extremely interesting. So that's one. It's only a fraction of those Tibetans in Canada, but it's a meaningful one. And also important to underline, Tibetan refugees at that time were the first refugees that Canada has accepted in the country. So they were like a test case, what is this refugee thing? Is it going to work? And then because it was so positive, quote and unquote, for Tibetans, then Canada has accepted more refugees from other countries. Thank you, Serena, for the for the comment.
If I may, is there some tentative date for the book launch for the?
First, the book needs to be finished, and because it is grassroots, it is made by people who have full-time jobs, so they can.
I know, but I met them in what in June last year. I talked to them, and they were like, well, we're hoping before the end of 2024. And I'm like, okay, so we're in 2025. How soon? So I'm really looking forward to the book coming out. So that's why I'm asking, but a few more months, I guess.
Yeah, well, I have told them that Grid is very happy to support the book launch with momos and maybe a dance or something, a party. But Grid is running out of money beginning of next year, so it has to be in the
It has to happen this year.
or in the winter, early winter of 2026. Otherwise, we cannot support. So I think it's coming because all the narratives have been edited and chosen. Now they're published in translated into French by another Grid member, one of my students. So it's going to be a bilingual book. So now it's in the final stages of production. It should come out in the fall, I hope.
And just to answer Natalia's question about sources, there isn't much yet on the other group, the 1000 project. And all the information I got was from websites. Well, I mean, I haven't checked for maybe 2 years, so maybe there is something more that has come out about the group, but at the time there really wasn't much about it, just basic facts and general information.
Thank you very much.
There is an ongoing sort of I don't know if you know Nima Dorji, who kind of was at the Project Tibet Society, which was the actual project who implemented the whole program for the Tibetan resettlement. He's a key figure, and I mean, my research was around Tibetan community organizations. So as part of that, I wanted to look into the Tibetan settlement and how that came into being. And he's a really great resource because he understands the project inside out because he was there from the beginning, and he even actually went back to Arunachal Pradesh and to Chuting and Pemako and all of the Tensigang, all of these settlements to talk to folks around it. In BC, in Vancouver too. And the project is interesting because all of the provinces who decided to take on the responsibility of resettling the Tibetan refugees from Arunachal Pradesh did it quite differently. In Vancouver, where I was involved with the project, we did it through the Tibetan, the reception house model, Nelenka model, because this is what the community knew. And there was, and it was a really great case example of where, people who, the ideologies around how community development should be organized and how community development should proceed in terms of grassroots collaboration. And there was real tension, but also a lot of interesting things that happened over the course of that project. So I think on the Western Canada side, Nimala would be a great person to talk to if you are interested in understanding the whole nuances of the project. And yeah.
Could you please repeat his organization? Where can we find him?
This was the Project Tibet Society. Project Tibet Society ran this. So Nimala, I actually interviewed him for my research project. And so I haven't had, because it kind of went because it was outside of the scope. But the Project Tibet Society was the organization created specifically for the Tibetan resettlement for Arunachal Pradesh. Yeah. And then the way it happened, the way it was structured was, centrally there was the Project Tibet Society, and then they would have local coordinators who would be running the program with the with the TAs at the grassroots level. And so every TA, some of them had sponsorship agreement holders, the SAHA holders, and some of them would team up with for example, like the Catholic Charities or with, different kinds of charitable organized immigrant aid societies. So it was run very differently. I know the Vancouver one quite well because I've been involved in it for a number of years. But even within that, there was also a difference. There was some that were brought directly through the community, through the Tibetan grassroots community organization like the Tibetan Association, or there was some that were brought through the Group of Five sponsorship model, which exists within the Canadian system. So it really, and also I think it's very interesting because in terms of like the integration trajectory of the Tibetan of the Tibetans individuals who were involved in that project, their kind of participation in community life really differed depending on the type of sponsorship that they had. So it's a very it was a very interesting project. Yeah.
If I can add something, during my fieldwork, I haven't exactly interviewed them, so they are not part of my respondents. But I met quite a lot of them during a ceremony that was organized at the TCCC in Etobicoke. So they came. I had the impression that all those Tibetans from the project had come to that particular event, to which I had also been invited, and say, okay, so they really are a closely knit group. Well, they were at the time, but they had almost just arrived, so it makes sense. But they were, brought together to the celebration.
Thank you to everyone, and first and foremost to Anne-Sophie. If there is anyone else who would like to jump in the last train with a question, then we should give it a shot. Otherwise, I would like to say once again that we are very grateful to have you with us during the great speaker series, and thank you so much for sharing with us. We wish you further progress and further success with your topic, and we hope that you come back maybe for another field research here in Canada.
And then be sure to connect with us in Montreal then.
Yes.
Well, yes. Last time I came to Montreal, but you were in India, so it was not the right time to come to Montreal. But I will definitely come back because I have this work that I want to do with Chisholm now. which I have already started last year in June, and I'm hoping to pursue. Well, I might wait for the book to be published to come back. We'll see, or I might try to come sooner than that, through Montreal, not directly to Toronto. And yes, I really wanted to thank you and thank the grid for giving me this opportunity to share my research about Tibetans in Toronto. It's I talk about my research to non-specialists, people who do not know anything about Tibet, which yeah, it's a very different audience, and yeah, it's very different reactions. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity.